a nested loop is just a loop inside body of another loop. Terminology you should be familiar with in reference to nested loops, and that is this inner loop and outer loop. The inner loop is the loop that's inside the loop, so the loop inside the loop, and then the outer loop is basically the outer loop, so it's the outside loop. So, I mean, this terminology seems pretty obvious, but it's just be familiar with it because you'll hear people talk about like the inner loop or the outer loop, and you'll want to know what they're talking about. Also, so if we have a nested loop, so a loop is going to repeat your code a certain number of times. So if we have nested loops, we can calculate the total repetitions of our loops by multiplying the number of inner loops by the number of outer loops. So this equals the total repetitions. So now I want to do some example code using nested loops. So what we want to do is we want to write a program that's going to print these things on the screen. So we're going to start with this one. So we're going to write a program that's going to print those stars like that. And then we're going to write, well, we're basically going to change our program so it displays the 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So what we want to do, let's go back and look at the instructions. So this says write a program that prints the following to the screen. And we want to ask the user for the number of rows, and then we don't want to allow them to enter a negative number. So theoretically, you could just do like if you knew the number of rows, like if we wanted to print exactly this, you could just do 5 cout statements, right? But we want to use a nested loop to do this, so we're not going to know the number of rows ahead of time, and we're going to print this using a nested loop. So the structure of the nested loop is that for each line, each line will be created by the outer loop, and the text that's on the line is going to be, so basically the horizontal text, like the stars, are going to be created from the inner loop. So what we want to do, let's just start with getting the number of rows from the user, because we know that we need to ask the user for the rows. So I'm going to have int rows, and I'm going to change this to rows. I'm just going to do a cout and ask the user for the number of rows, so enter the number of rows. And then we're going to do a cin rows. And then we want a while loop, so we want to check and see, we want to make sure they didn't enter a negative number. And the best way to do that is going to be with a while loop. So we're going to do while rows is less than or equal to 0. And I didn't specify that they couldn't enter 0, I just said negative, but I don't want them to enter a 0 either. So while rows is less than or equal to 0, we're going to do a cout invalid row, enter a positive number, and then let's do a cin rows. So then we need our nested loop. So I already have the structure of this a little bit, so I just want to go through what this is doing. So this is saying, okay, int I is equal to 1, and, well, I is less than or equal to rows, so rows is the number that the user enters. So this outer loop is going to run for the number of rows that we want. So for instance, if the user enters 6, this is going to print 6 rows of stars. And let's pull this back up. So for instance, when this runs this first, so let's just, I'm going to finish typing the code for the inner loop, and then we'll look at this in detail to see what it's doing. So for the inner loop, I'm going to want int j is equal to 1, j less than or equal to I, so that's this outer loop, and then we want to increment our counter. And so inside this inner loop, we're going to have cout, and I'm going to have the star, and I want to put a space, and then once it runs this inner loop, I want it to go to the next line before it runs the outer loop again. So I'm going to have cout. I'm actually put this on the next line. So cout \n, or you could do an end line here. So let's see if this is working, and then we'll go through the code in detail and see how it's working. But let's compile this. Oh, and there's an error somewhere. I can't have a space right here. So number of rows, let's just do 6. All right. So let's look at what this is doing. Like, let's just look at this in detail. So we have, let's look at our first loop. So our outer loop, we have that I is equal to 1. So we're on the first row. I less than rows. So this outer loop is going to run 6 times, basically. And we see that with the rows. So each outer loop prints a row, or goes to a new row. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then for the inner loop, we have j is equal to 1, and then j less than or equal to I. Well, so I is equal to 1 currently. And so we're going to cout a star, and then j increments to 2. Since I is currently equal to 1, the loop is just the condition is false now, so then it goes down here and goes to the new line. So then we're back at the outer loop. Now I is equal to 2. So we're on the second line here. I is equal to 2. And then we go to this inner loop, and j starts over again at 1. So 1 is less than or equal to I. So this is true, so it's going to print a star and a space. J increments to 2. J is less than or equal to 2, so it's going to print another star and space. J increments to 3. Now this condition's false, so it's going to exit and go to the new line. So now it's back up here in the outer loop. So we've gone to the next line, so now we're on line 3. Now I is equal to 3, and it goes to the inner loop. We have j is equal to 1. 1 is less than or equal to 3. That's true, so it's going to print a star. And it's going to do this 3 times until j is equal to 4, and then that condition becomes false, and it goes to the new line, so now we're on line 4. With these programs, sometimes it's really helpful to physically write down what's happening, write down what each of your variables is equal to as the program is running, and then just step through and instead of trying to figure out what it's doing, if we just look at this, it's really hard to figure out what this is doing. But if you go through it row by row and just look at what it's doing each step of the way, I think it becomes a little more clear how it's working. So now what we want to do is change this so it prints out these numbers instead of the stars. Yeah, so what would we change it to?
Change it to J.
Yeah. And why would we change it to J?
J is going to go up each time and then be reset.
Yep. So let's do a space after this as well. Whoops. So let's run this. Let's do 5. Oh, something's wrong. Oh, I said space and then I put a new line. Try this again. 5. All right, that looks right. And then what if we wanted to invert these? Like, what if we wanted this row, so the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to appear first, 1, 2, 3, 4 second, 1, 2, 3 third, and so on.
When we switch, so the I is equal to 5, right? We're going to have to change the plus plus to minus minus.
Yeah.
And the J as well.
Well, I don't know if we're going to change the J because we're just, this is still going to be incrementing. We're just basically turning this upside down. So we have the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 first.
So I would be equal to rows, and then while I is greater than or equal to 1.
Yeah,
That way.
I is greater than or equal to 1.
Yeah, and then I is equal to rows.
Yeah. So let's see if this works.